The barrel of the Colt 45 pressed against the man's temple, cold and unforgiving as the eyes of the man who held it. Mason Everett's weathered hand was steady, belying his 64 years and the illness that gnawed at his lungs. "One more time," Mason said, his voice low and measured in the dimly lit corner of the Texas saloon. "Where is the auction being held?" The slave trader's eyes darted nervously around the empty room, finding no salvation in the dingy walls or the bartender who had conveniently stepped outside. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the evening chill. "Kill me if you want, old man. They'll do worse if I talk." Mason cocked the hammer, the metallic click echoing in the silence. "I'm dying anyway. Nothing to lose. Can you say the same?" Something in Mason's tone, perhaps the flat certainty in it, made the trader believe him. His resolve crumbled. "Black Creek Barn, 10 miles east of town. Tonight at midnight." The words tumbled out in a desperate rush. "But you're wasting your time. Even if you find who you're looking for, they'll hunt you down." Mason eased the hammer back and lowered the gun, but didn't holster it. "The girl with the hourglass scar on her wrist, she'll be there?" The trader nodded, relief washing over his face as death retreated an inch. "Arrived last week. Dark hair, green eyes, silent type. Been sold 3 times already." Mason's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes. The first spark of hope in 8 long years of searching. "If you're lying," he left the threat unfinished. "I ain't, but you're a dead man walking into that auction." The trader rubbed his wrists where the ropes had cut into them. "Whatever you owe this girl, it ain't worth your life." Mason holstered his gun and tossed a coin on the table. "That's where you're wrong." As he stepped out into the Texas night, Mason's mind drifted back to another night, 8 years earlier. Rain had poured down, mixing with blood and mud. Augustus Reed had lain dying in Mason's arms, his final words barely audible above the thunder. "Find my daughter, the scar, like an hourglass. Protect her from them. Promise me, Mason." And Mason had promised, not knowing then how long the road would be, how many dead ends and disappointments awaited him, not knowing his own time was running short. A coughing fit doubled him over as he reached his horse. He covered his mouth with a handkerchief, and when he pulled it away, it was stained crimson. The consumption was getting worse. The doctor in Austin had given him 6 months. That had been 4 months ago. "Just a little more time," he whispered. Whether to Gar or the ghost of Augustus Reed, he couldn't say. "Just enough to keep my promise." The Black Creek Barn stood like a sentinel of darker times at the edge of a forgotten pine forest. The Civil War had officially ended 4 years ago, but in places like this, old ways persisted in the shadows, beyond the reach of federal marshals and Reconstruction laws. Mason kept to the back of the crowd, his hat pulled low. 24 men filled the barn, their faces illuminated by hanging lanterns that cast more shadows than light. He recognized a few: former Confederate officers, wealthy landowners, men who had prospered during the war while others starved. The auctioneer, a rail-thin man with tobacco-stained teeth, gestured dramatically as a young man was led onto the crude wooden platform. The bidding was perfunctory, the price settled quickly. Mason waited, tension coiling in his chest that had nothing to do with his illness. What if his information was wrong? What if she had been sold already? What if— "Next up," the auctioneer called out, cutting through Mason's thoughts. "Something special for you gentlemen. 22 years old, no family, been sold 3 times but still got some spirit in her." 2 men dragged a woman onto the platform. Her wrists were bound with rough rope, her dress torn and dirty. Dark hair hung partially across her face, but Mason could see enough. His breath caught. Those eyes. Green like her father's, but with none of Augustus's warmth or humor. These were the eyes of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and expected nothing better. The auctioneer circled her like a vulture. Starting bid at $5. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even in illegal auctions like this, men preferred their property more docile, more broken. This one, despite her silence, had an air about her that suggested a spirit not yet crushed, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hands curled into fists. "Come now, gentlemen," the auctioneer prodded, his grin faltering. $5 is a bargain." A man at the front spat on the dirt floor. Not worth a single dime. Seen her kind before. More trouble than they're worth. $3 then, the auctioneer amended, desperation creeping into his tone. The woman's shoulders tensed further, though her face remained hidden. I'll pay 30. Mason's voice carried clearly across the barn. Heads turned, eyes narrowed as they took in his faded clothing and weathered appearance. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. 30? You're sure, mister? Mason stepped forward into the pool of lantern light. I'm sure. As he approached the platform to pay, the woman finally lifted her head fully. Eyes the color of rain-washed jade met his, not empty as he'd expected, but burning with quiet defiance. The auctioneer yanked at her arm, turning her slightly, and that's when Mason saw it. The scar on her left wrist, shaped like an hourglass. His breath caught. 8 years had passed, but he would recognize that mark anywhere. Your name? He asked quietly as he counted out the crumpled bills. The auctioneer answered for her. Goes by Sarah, Sarah Reed. The name hit Mason like a physical blow. Reed. 8 years of searching, following whispers and rumors across 5 states. And now here she stood before him. Augustus Reed's daughter. The auctioneer pushed Sarah toward him. She's all yours, mister. No refunds if she don't work out. Mason took her arm gently, feeling her stiffen at his touch. Let's go, he murmured, guiding her through the crowd. Outside, the Texas night wrapped around them, warm and heavy with the promise of rain. His horse, a sturdy brown gelding, waited patiently beside a smaller mare he'd purchased earlier that day. Mason helped Sarah onto the mare, noting how she winced at the movement. They rode in silence, leaving the sordid auction barn behind. The moon occasionally peeked through gathering clouds, casting silver light across the rolling landscape. After an hour, when they'd put sufficient distance between themselves and the auction, Mason pulled his horse to a stop beside a small creek. We'll rest here for a bit. He dismounted, reaching for his canteen. Sarah remained on her horse, watching him with those wary green eyes. Her wrists were still bound, the rope cutting into her skin. Mason approached her slowly, pulling a small knife from his belt. I'm going to cut those ropes. She didn't respond, but her gaze flicked to the knife, then back to his face, assessing. I won't hurt you, he added softly. With careful movements, he sliced through the ropes. As they fell away, Sarah rubbed her wrists, wincing as circulation returned to her hands. The hourglass scar stood out starkly against her reddened skin. No one should wear bonds in a free country, Mason said, returning the knife to his belt. He extended the canteen to her. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his. Sarah drank deeply, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough from disuse but carried a sharp edge. You paid for me. What do you want? The question hung in the night air, laden with implications. Mason moved away, giving her space, and settled on a rock by the creek's edge. I didn't buy you to own you. I just couldn't watch them sell you again. A bitter laugh escaped her, short, dry, cutting. You think that makes you a hero? No. The simplicity of his answer seemed to surprise her. No heroes left in this world, Miss Reed. Just people trying to make up for their mistakes. She studied him with narrowed eyes. And what mistake are you trying to make up for, Mr. Everett? Mason Everett. He looked out at the dark water. I knew your father. Sarah turned away, her profile sharp against the night sky. Everyone claims that after it's too late. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees above them. Mason felt a familiar tightness in his chest, but suppressed the urge to cough. Not now. We should keep moving, he said eventually. My place is still a few hours' ride from here. Your place? Her voice held a note of suspicion. A small ranch, not much, but it's quiet. Safe. He hesitated. You'll have your own room. No one will bother you there. Sarah stared into the darkness for a long moment. Then, without a word, she returned to the mare and pulled herself up. Mason took it as agreement and mounted his own horse. They rode through the night, the distant rumble of thunder their constant companion. Occasionally, Mason would glance back, making sure Sarah was still following. Each time he found her gaze already on him, watchful, evaluating. During one such glance, he was struck by how much she resembled Augustus. The same determined set of the jaw, the same analytical gaze. But there was something else there too, something hard that Augustus had never possessed. 8 years of bondage had forged steel where there had once been gold. Another coughing fit threatened to overtake him, and Mason gripped the saddle horn tightly until it passed. He tasted blood but swallowed it back. Sarah noticed. "Your demons riding with you tonight?" she asked, her tone neutral. Mason forced his grip to relax. Always. By the time they reached the ranch, the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern hills. Mason's property sat nestled against a gentle slope, a small cabin with a barn and corral beside it. A creek wound through the property, disappearing into a stand of oak trees. "It's not much," Mason said as they approached, suddenly conscious of the cabin's weathered appearance. "It has walls and a roof," Sarah replied. "That's more than I've had some nights." They dismounted and Mason took both horses to the barn. When he returned, Sarah was standing where he'd left her, as though unsure of her place in this new arrangement. "Come inside," he said gently. "You must be tired." The cabin's interior was simple but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a wooden table with 2 chairs. A corridor led to 2 bedrooms at the back. "You'll sleep here," Mason indicated the smaller bedroom. "I'm across the hall." Sarah stepped hesitantly into the bedroom. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small dresser, a washstand with a pitcher and basin. What caught her attention, however, was the bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes, and beside it, a desk with writing materials neatly arranged. "This was prepared," she observed, a question in her voice. Mason stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I've been searching for you for 8 years, Miss Reed. I always believed I'd find you someday." Her fingers ran lightly over the spines of the books, as if surprised by their presence. "These are medical texts. Your father was a doctor before the war. I thought you might have inherited his interest." Sarah turned to him, suspicion clouding her features once more. "How do you know so much about me?" Mason hesitated, then stepped toward a small sideboard where a framed photograph stood. He handed it to Sarah. "This was taken in '60, before everything changed." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she took the photograph. 4 people stood in front of a grand house. A tall, distinguished man with kind eyes, a beautiful woman with dark hair like Sarah's, a young girl of about 14, and a younger Mason, standing straight and proud beside a woman with gentle eyes and a warm smile. "My parents," Sarah whispered, her finger hovering over the images as if afraid they might disappear. "And me," her voice caught. "And you, with your wife?" "Clara," Mason confirmed, a shadow crossing his face. "She and your mother were close friends." Sarah stared at the photograph, memories stirring behind her eyes like creatures long dormant. I barely remember them." "I'll bring water for the basin," Mason said, moving toward the door. "There are clean clothes in the dresser. Rest as long as you need." At the doorway, he paused. "Dra," he said quietly, "you're safe here. I know that doesn't mean much coming from a stranger who just bought you at auction, but I give you my word for whatever it's worth." After he left, Sarah stood motionless in the center of the room, the photograph still clutched in her hands. After 8 years of captivity, of being passed from owner to owner, the concept of safety seemed as foreign as the moon. She set the photograph down carefully and explored the room further. The clothes in the dresser were simple but well made. Cotton dresses, a nightgown, undergarments. The books on the shelf were a mixture of medical texts, novels, and poetry collections. Everything spoke of careful preparation, of expectation. This man had been searching for her specifically. Not just any slave to purchase, but her. Why? What did he really want? What connection had he truly had with her father? Sarah lay down on the bed, the softness of the mattress almost uncomfortable after years of sleeping on hard floors. Sleep eluded her, her mind turning over the day's events, examining them from every angle like a worn coin. Outside, Mason sat on the porch steps, watching the sun rise over his modest property. The weight of the past 8 years seemed to press down on his shoulders. "I found her, Clara," he whispered to the dawn. "I kept my promise." But even as the words left his lips, he felt the familiar twist of guilt in his gut. For the promise he spoke of was more complicated than it seemed, tangled in a web of old loyalties, bitter regrets, and blood debts yet to be paid. A coughing fit doubled him over, more violent than before. When it finally subsided, he looked at the blood-speckled handkerchief with resignation. Time was running out faster than he'd thought. He needed to make things right while he still could. Sarah woke to late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, she was disoriented, unused to waking in a real bed, in a room with walls and a door she could close. The memories of the auction, of Mason Everett, of the long ride to this ranch came flooding back. She rose and washed her face in the basin, the cool water a luxury she hadn't enjoyed in years. The woman who stared back at her from the small mirror above the washstand was a stranger. Gaunt face, haunted eyes, dark hair limp and dull. 8 years had transformed the 14-year-old girl in the photograph into something barely recognizable. After changing into one of the cotton dresses from the dresser, Sarah cautiously ventured out of the bedroom. The main room was empty, but through the window she could see Mason in the corral, working with a young horse. His movements were patient and deliberate, speaking of years of experience. Sarah explored the cabin, her physician's daughter's eye cataloging details. The main room was sparsely furnished but comfortable. A worn leather armchair by the fireplace, bookshelves filled with volumes on various subjects, a sideboard with photographs. But what caught her attention was the adjoining room she hadn't noticed last night. It was clearly set up as a small apothecary. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of herbs, powders, and tinctures. A work table held scales, mortars, and pestles, and various instruments Sarah recognized from her father's practice. A cabinet displayed surgical tools, clean and well-maintained. Everything spoke of medical knowledge and practice. Sarah ran her fingers along the workbench, memories of watching her father at similar tasks flooding back. The familiar sense of dried herbs and alcohol tinctures awakened something long dormant within her. "He was teaching you, wasn't he?" Mason's voice came from the doorway. Sarah turned, startled. She hadn't heard him enter. "My father? Yes, before." Mason nodded, understanding the unspoken. "Augustus always said you had a natural talent. Even at 14, you could identify herbs most trained physicians couldn't name. You were a doctor, too?" Sarah gestured to the room. A shadow crossed Mason's face. "Army surgeon, Union side. Not much call for that now." He moved to the cabinet and opened a drawer, revealing more instruments. "These days, I mostly treat minor ailments for folks who can't afford the town doctor. Nothing fancy." Sarah studied him with new interest. "Union surgeon. My father was Confederate. We were friends long before states started choosing sides." Mason closed the drawer with a finality that suggested the topic was closed for now. "You must be hungry. I've made some stew." They ate in silence, the simple meal of venison stew and cornbread tasting better than anything Sarah had eaten in years. Throughout the meal, she sensed Mason watching her, not in the predatory way she'd grown accustomed to from previous owners, but with a curious mix of sadness and hope. "Why were you looking for me?" Sarah finally asked, setting down her spoon. "The truth this time." Mason met her gaze steadily. "I made a promise to your father before he died." "When was that?" The question was sharp, direct. 1861, the night your home burned." Mason's voice was quiet but clear. "I was too late to save your parents. Your father lived just long enough to make me promise I'd find you and keep you safe." Sarah's hands gripped the edge of the table. 8 years. It took you 8 years to fulfill this promise? Pain flickered across Mason's weathered face. "Yes, when I finally reached your home that night, you were already gone. The house was in flames, your parents dead. No sign of you except reports of a girl with a scar being taken east. I've been tracking you ever since, following every rumor, every whisper of a young woman with an hourglass scar. And now you've found me." Sarah's voice was flat. "Paid $30 for your redemption." Mason flinched as if struck. It wasn't about redemption. Then what? Before he could answer, a coughing fit overtook him, more violent than any Sarah had witnessed so far. He doubled over, his face contorted in pain as he pressed a handkerchief to his mouth. When he finally regained control, Sarah could see the cloth was stained crimson. "Consumption," she stated. Not a question, but a diagnosis. Mason nodded, tucking the handkerchief away. About 2 months left, according to the doctor in Austin. Sarah absorbed this information, her mind working quickly. That's why you intensified your search. You're running out of time. Yes. The simple admission hung in the air between them. Sarah rose from the table, gathering the dishes with practiced efficiency. Well, Mr. Everett, you found me. Consider your promise fulfilled. Once you've shown me how to manage here, you can die with a clear conscience. The cruelty of her words surprised even her, but 8 years of bondage had taught Sarah that vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford. Better to keep this man at a distance, promise or no promise. Mason watched her move about the kitchen, his expression unreadable. There's more to it than that, Sarah. Things you need to know about your father, about what happened, about why they came for your family. Sarah stiffened, her back to him. I know why they came. We were Union sympathizers in Confederate territory. Traitors, they called us. It was more complicated than that. Mason rose from the table with effort. But that's a conversation for another day. You're tired, and I've pushed enough for one night. He moved toward the door, then paused. There's a piano in the sitting room if you're interested. Your mother mentioned once that she was teaching you. The unexpected mention of such a normal, peaceful activity from her past life caught Sarah off guard. For a moment, the hardened shell she'd built around herself cracked, revealing the girl she'd once been. The girl who had sat beside her mother on a piano bench, laughing at her own mistakes. I haven't played in 8 years, she said softly. The offer stands. Good night, Miss Reed. After Mason retired to his room, Sarah found herself drawn to the sitting room she hadn't explored earlier. The piano stood against the wall, an upright model, its wood polished to a soft glow. She ran her fingers over the keys without pressing them, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips. On an impulse, she sat on the bench and placed her hands in position, muscle memory guiding them to a simple melody her mother had taught her. The first notes were tentative, uncertain, but as she continued, the music flowed more naturally, filling the quiet house with gentle sound. Unknown to Sarah, Mason stood in the hallway listening. The melody was one Clara had often played in the evenings before the war, before everything changed. Tears filled his eyes as the past and present merged in the bittersweet notes. He made no sound as he retreated to his room, leaving Sarah to her momentary peace. Later that night, unable to sleep, Sarah explored the bookshelves in her room more thoroughly. Behind a row of medical texts, she discovered a leather-bound journal. Curiosity overcame her caution, and she opened it. The handwriting was feminine, elegant. The first page bore a simple inscription, Clara Everett, 1860, Mason's wife. Sarah settled on the bed and began to read, drawn into the world of a woman who had known her parents, who had been part of her childhood before it was stolen from her. Clara's words painted a picture of life before the war, a happy marriage, a small but thriving ranch, the friendship between the Everetts and the Reeds. But as Sarah turned the pages, moving through the early war years, a name caught her eye, sending a chill down her spine. Sheriff Randall Holloway. Clara wrote of him with evident distaste. April 18, 1862. Holloway visited again today, asking questions about Union sympathizers in the area. The way he looks at me when Mason isn't present makes my skin crawl. I told him nothing, of course, but I fear he suspects our connections to the Reed family. Sarah sat up straighter, her heart pounding. Holloway, the man who had led the attack on her family's home. The man who had stood by and watched as her parents were executed for treason. She read on, her fingers trembling slightly. June 10, 1862. Mason met with Holloway today. He believes providing some information about minor Union movements might help end the war sooner. I fear he's being naive. Men like Holloway don't care about peace. They care about power. Sarah nearly dropped the journal. Mason had met with Holloway? Had provided him information? Before she could read further, a sound from outside drew her attention. Through the window, she could see Mason in the yard. On his knees, hands clutched to his head, as if in terrible pain. His body shook with what appeared to be silent sobs. Despite her newfound suspicion, Sarah found herself moving toward the door. Whatever Mason Everett's sins might be, he was clearly a man in torment. The grass was cold beneath her bare feet as she approached him cautiously. Mr. Everett? She called softly. He didn't respond, lost in whatever horror gripped him. His eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on some middle distance where ghosts from his past seemed to dance. "The artillery," he muttered, his voice strained. "They're flanking us. Get down. Get down." Understanding dawned on Sarah. She had seen this before. Men returned from war, haunted by battles that continued to rage in their minds long after the guns had fallen silent. Her father had called it soldier's heart. She knelt beside him, careful not to touch him. "Mason," she said louder this time, "the war is over. You're at your ranch. You're safe, Joe." His breathing was ragged, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "So much blood," he whispered. "Can't wash it off." Sarah took a chance. She moved directly into his line of sight, forcing him to see her. "Look at me, Mason. It's 1869. The war ended 4 years ago. You're in Texas on your ranch." Slowly, recognition flickered in his eyes. They focused on her face, confusion giving way to awareness, then shame. He pulled back, pushing himself to his feet with shaking hands. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "Did I wake you?" "It's all right," she replied, rising as well. "I've seen it before. My father, after Shiloh." Mason nodded, struggling to compose himself. Augustus was at Shiloh, took a bullet in the shoulder. He ran a hand through his hair, still visibly shaken. "I should get back inside." But as he turned to go, Sarah found herself asking, "Why did you meet with Holloway during the war?" Mason froze, then slowly turned back to face her, his expression guarded. "You've been reading Clara's journal." Sarah didn't deny it. "Did you give him information about my family?" The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Finally, Mason spoke, his voice barely audible above the night sounds of the ranch. "Yes." The single word hit Sarah like a physical blow. She took a step back, her mind reeling with implications. You told him about my father?" Mason's face was a mask of ancient grief. "I didn't know then what Holloway would do with the information. I thought I was helping end the war." Sarah's voice rose, anger replacing shock. "My parents were executed because of you?" "I didn't know," Mason repeated, the words hollow in the night air. "By the time I learned what Holloway had done, it was too late. I rode to your home as fast as I could, but the house was already burning." Sarah felt her world tilting on its axis. The man who had searched for her for 8 years, who had purchased her freedom, who had prepared a room and books and piano, this same man had set in motion the events that destroyed her family. "You bought me out of guilt," she whispered, the realization dawning with terrible clarity. Mason didn't deny it. "Partly," he admitted, "but also because of a promise. When I found your father dying, he made me swear to find you, to protect you from Holloway and his kind." "Why should I believe you?" Sarah demanded, tears threatening despite her effort to remain strong. "You shouldn't," Mason replied simply. "I've given you no reason to trust me. All I can offer is the truth, however painful." Sarah turned away, unable to bear the sight of him any longer. Without another word, she walked back to the cabin, each step heavy with the weight of revelation. Behind her, Mason remained in the yard, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had known this moment would come, had dreaded it for 8 years. Now that it had arrived, he found he had no defense against the accusation in Sarah's eyes. "I'm trying, Augustus," he whispered to the stars, "but I don't know if I can make this right." In her room, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, Clara's journal still open beside her. The foundation of her newfound freedom had just crumbled beneath her feet. The man who had rescued her was also the man who had condemned her family. Yet something didn't quite add up. If Mason had betrayed her family out of malice, why spend 8 years searching for her? Why prepare this room, these books, the piano? Why teach her to shoot, as he'd offered earlier? Sarah returned to the journal, determined to find more answers. As she read further, a picture began to emerge of a Mason Everett, far different from the man who had just confessed to betraying her family. Clara wrote of his growing disillusionment with the war, his horror at the atrocities committed on both sides. She described his increasing suspicion of Holloway and the Confederate command structure. But it was an entry dated 2 months after her parents' deaths that truly caught Sarah's attention. August 15th, 1862. Mason returned from his search for the Reed girl today, half dead from exhaustion. Still no sign of her, but he found something else. evidence that Holloway has been profiting from the properties of executed traitors. Mason believes our Holloway targeted the Reed family not for their Union sympathies, but because Augustus had discovered his corruption. I fear what this means for us if Holloway suspects Mason knows. Sarah closed the journal, her mind racing. If this was true, her parents hadn't died simply because they were Union sympathizers. They had died because her father had uncovered something dangerous, something that threatened Holloway. And Mason, despite his initial role in her family's destruction, had spent the last 8 years of his life trying to make amends, knowing full well he was dying of consumption. The complexity of it all overwhelmed her. Sarah lay back on the bed, physically and emotionally exhausted. Sleep claimed her eventually, but her dreams were filled with burning houses, hourglass scars, and the sound of a piano playing a melancholy tune. The morning dawned clear and cool, sunlight filtering through the pine trees surrounding the Everett Ranch. Sarah stood on the porch, watching as Mason worked with a young bay mare in the corral. Despite her conflicted feelings about him after last night's revelation, she couldn't deny his skill with horses. His movements were gentle but firm, establishing boundaries while building trust, a stark contrast to the violence of his nightmares. She had barely slept, her mind churning with everything she had learned. Mason Everett, Union surgeon, friend to her father, betrayer of her family, her rescuer, a dying man seeking redemption. The contradictions were impossible to reconcile. Sarah's attention was drawn to a group of riders approaching along the main road. 3 men on horseback, moving with purpose. She tensed instinctively, years of captivity having taught her to be wary of strangers. Mason had seen them too. He secured the mare in the corral and walked toward the house, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. "Get inside," he said quietly as he passed Sarah. "Stay out of sight." Sarah hesitated. "Who is it?" "Trouble." The single word carried enough weight to send her retreating into the cabin, though she positioned herself by the window where she could observe without being seen. The riders approached, 2 younger men flanking an older one. The leader sat tall in his saddle, a silver star pinned to his vest marking him as law enforcement. Even from a distance, the long scar on his right cheek was visible, cutting a pale line through his weather-beaten skin. Mason stepped forward to meet them, his posture deceptively relaxed, though Sarah noted how he never let his hand stray far from his gun. "Sullivan," the scarred man called, pulling his horse to a stop. "Sheriff Holloway," Mason replied, his voice giving away nothing. "What brings you out this way?" Sarah's breath caught. Holloway, the man from Clara's journal, the man who had ordered the execution of her parents. She watched more intently now, noting the false congeniality in the sheriff's smile, the calculating look in his eyes. "Just making my rounds," Holloway answered, dismounting with fluid grace despite his age. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, his hair salt and pepper beneath his hat, his clothing well-maintained but not ostentatious. "Heard you bought something at Black Creek auction. Thought I'd see it for myself." Mason shrugged. "Free country, a man can buy what he needs." Holloway chuckled, though the sound held no warmth. His gaze drifted to the cabin, and Sarah instinctively stepped back from the window. "Funny thing," he continued, "I've been looking for a particular woman, runaway. Dark hair, green eyes, distinctive scar on her wrist." He traced an hourglass shape in the air with his finger. "Sounds familiar?" "Plenty of women with dark hair and green eyes," Mason replied evenly. "Can't say I've noticed any particular scars." "Mind if I have a little look around? Official business, you understand." "Got a warrant?" "Don't need one. Got reports of a fugitive." "Fugitive from what?" Mason's tone remained conversational, but his stance had subtly shifted, ready for conflict. "War's been over 4 years. Slavery is illegal now. Or hadn't you heard?" Holloway's smile tightened. "Some crimes supersede changes in the law, Everett. Treason, for instance. Murder. Theft of valuable property. Sounds serious, but I don't see what it has to do with my ranch." The standoff continued for several tense moments. From her hiding place, Sarah could see the 2 younger men, the Yates brothers, she presumed, shifting uneasily in their saddles, hands hovering near their weapons. Finally, Holloway's gaze shifted, catching a glimpse of movement as Sarah adjusted her position by the window. "Well now," he drawled, "what do we have here?" He started toward the cabin, but Mason stepped into his path. "She's not who you're looking for, Holloway. I have the bill of sale. She belongs to me now. Belongs? Holloway's eyebrow arched. Strange word for a union, man. Thought you fought against that very concept. You know what I mean, Mason replied coldly. She's under my protection. Legal and proper. Holloway studied him for a long moment, then glanced again at the cabin. Interesting. Everett the Righteous buying a woman. Times do change. He turned back to his horse but paused to place something on the fence post. A single bullet, gleaming dully in the morning sun. A reminder, he said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Some ghosts don't stay buried, Everett. With that, he mounted his horse, and the three riders departed, dust rising in their wake. Mason remained where he stood until they were out of sight, then retrieved the bullet from the fence post, examining it before pocketing it. Sarah emerged from the cabin, her face pale but composed. That was him, wasn't it? The man who killed my family. Yes, Mason confirmed grimly. Sheriff Randall Holloway, the most dangerous man in 3 counties. What does he want with me? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Mason's expression darkened. It's not you he wants, Sarah. It's what you might know. About what? About the list. Your father's list of traitors who profited from the war. Men who betrayed both sides for personal gain. Men like Holloway. Sarah absorbed this information, pieces of her fragmented past beginning to align. The list? That's what was in Clara's journal, what my father discovered about Holloway. Yes, Mason confirmed, and Holloway has spent 8 years eliminating anyone who might know about it, including your family. Then why am I still alive? I was there when they came. I saw their faces. You were a child, Mason explained. They didn't think you'd remember or survive long enough to tell anyone. By the time Holloway realized his mistake, you had disappeared into the chaos after the war. Sarah studied Mason's face, searching for deception, but finding only grim certainty. And you? How do you fit into all this now? Mason looked away, his profile sharp against the morning light. I told you last night I gave Holloway information about your father, not knowing what he'd do with it. By the time I realized his true intentions, it was too late. So now you're, what, trying to make amends by protecting me from him? Something like that, Mason agreed, though his tone suggested there was more to the story. Come on, there's something I need to show you. He led her to the small apothecary room, where he unlocked a cabinet Sarah hadn't noticed before. Inside were several journals similar to Clara's, but the handwriting was different. Bold, precise, masculine. Your father's medical journals, Mason explained, carefully removing one. Clara salvaged them from your family's home before it was completely destroyed. I've kept them safe, hoping someday to return them to you. Sarah took the journal with trembling hands, running her fingers over the familiar handwriting. Memories flooded back, sitting on her father's lap as he explained anatomy drawings, helping him grind herbs for his medicines, watching with fascination as he set a neighbor's broken arm. He was teaching you, Mason said softly. Clara mentioned how proud he was of your aptitude. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. These journals were a tangible connection to the father she'd lost, the life that had been stolen from her. I've maintained his supplies as best I could, Mason continued, gesturing to the apothecary. Added some of my own from my time as an army surgeon. It's all yours now. Sarah looked up sharply. Why give me this? Mason's expression was complicated. Regret, hope, resignation all mingled in his weathered features. Because it's rightfully yours. Because Augustus would have wanted you to have it. And because I'm dying, Sarah. When I'm gone, someone should continue this work. The stark reminder of his mortality hung between them. Sarah returned her attention to the journal, unable to process the complexity of emotions his words stirred in her. I'll leave you with them, Mason said, moving toward the door. Take all the time you need. Left alone with her father's writings, Sarah settled at the workbench and began to read. Hours slipped by as she immersed herself in her father's world, in his methodical approach to medicine, his observations of patients, his experiments with various treatments. It was like hearing his voice again after 8 long years of silence. As daylight faded, Sarah realized she had been reading for hours. She stood, stretching her stiff muscles, and went in search of Mason. She found him in the barn, preparing a mixture of herbs. Poultice for the bay mare's leg, he explained, noting her questioning look. She strained it yesterday. Sarah approached, examining the mixture. Arnica and comfrey. Good choices. But you could add some willow bark for the inflammation. Mason raised an eyebrow. You remember your father's teachings well. Not just his. Sarah's voice was quiet. During my time away, I was sold to a plantation owner whose wife fancied herself a healer. She had me prepare her remedies. I learned which ones worked and which ones didn't. Mason's expression darkened at the reminder of her captivity, but he nodded to the mixture. Show me. Sarah added the willow bark, explaining the proportions as she worked. Mason watched with evident respect, making no attempt to correct or direct her. When she finished, he gathered the poultice and led her to the mare's stall. Would you like to apply it? He offered, holding out the mixture. Sarah hesitated only briefly before taking it. As she gently applied the poultice to the mare's injured leg, she felt a spark of her old self, the girl who had dreamed of following in her father's footsteps, of healing rather than being hurt. You have a gift, Mason observed as she finished. Just like Augustus said. The simple statement, delivered without flattery or agenda, touched something deep within Sarah. For 8 years, she had been property, a tool for others' use. To be valued for a skill, for knowledge that was hers alone, felt like reclaiming a piece of her stolen identity. They worked in companionable silence, tending to the other horses, Mason respecting her space while acknowledging her competence. As they finished and headed back to the cabin, Sarah found herself asking about something that had bothered her since the morning's confrontation. Why did Holloway call you Sullivan? Mason paused, his hand on the barn door. Because that was my name once, Mason Sullivan Everett. I started using just Everett after the war, when I began searching for use. Too many people knew Sullivan as a Union surgeon. And as Holloway's informant, Sarah added, the edge returning to her voice. Mason didn't flinch from the accusation. Yes, that too. Back at the cabin, they prepared a simple dinner together, the routine establishing a tentative normalcy despite the undercurrents of tension and unresolved questions. As they ate, Mason broached the subject that had been simmering between them. Holloway won't stop looking for you. Now that he knows you're here, he'll be watching the ranch. Why does he care so much about this list after all these years? Sarah asked. Mason set down his fork, his expression grave. Because it doesn't just name him. It names powerful men throughout Texas, judges, bankers, politicians who profited from the war while pretending to serve either the Union or the Confederacy. Men who've rebuilt their fortunes and reputations since the war ended. Men like Judge Elias Harrison, Sarah said, recalling a name from Clara's journal. Mason's eyes widened slightly. You remember Harrison? Sarah shook her head. Clara mentioned him in her journal. She seemed afraid of him. With good reason, Mason confirmed. Harrison is the real power in this county. Holloway is dangerous, but Harrison is lethal. He's built a reputation as a fair and honorable judge while concealing the blood on his hands. What blood? Mason hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. Harrison was one of the key figures in your father's list, but he was more than that. He was also... A coughing fit interrupted him, more severe than any Sarah had witnessed before. Mason doubled over, his face contorted with pain as he fought for breath. Blood speckled the table as he struggled to control the spasms. Without thinking, Sarah moved to his side, supporting him until the fit subsided. You need to rest, she said firmly, her healer's instincts taking over. We can continue this conversation tomorrow. Mason didn't argue, allowing her to help him to his bedroom. His weakness frightened Sarah, not for her own safety, but because she realized how quickly his condition was deteriorating. The doctor in Austin had been optimistic in his 2-month prognosis. After settling Mason in his room, Sarah returned to the apothecary. She searched through her father's journals until she found what she was looking for, a treatment for consumption that combined traditional medicine with newer approaches. It wouldn't cure Mason, but it might ease his symptoms and buy him a little more time. She worked late into the night, preparing the tincture according to her father's specifications. As she worked, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been property, with no control over her fate. Now she was free, using her father's knowledge to help the man who had both betrayed her family and rescued her from bondage. The contradiction was impossible to resolve. Part of her wanted to hate Mason for his role in her parents' deaths. Another part recognized the 8 years of searching, the room prepared for her, the medical journals preserved, the skills being passed on, all evidence of genuine remorse and a desire to make amends. And beneath it all, the knowledge that her time with Mason was limited. Whatever answers he held about her past, whatever closure he might provide, would die with him in a matter of weeks without intervention. Dawn found Sarah in the kitchen preparing a simple breakfast in the medicinal tea she had brewed during the night. When Mason emerged from his room, she noted the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. "Sit," she instructed, placing the steaming mug before him. "Drink this, all of it." Mason raised an eyebrow at her authoritative tone, but complied without argument. "What is it?" "Something from my father's journals. It won't cure you, but it should help with the pain and breathing." Mason took a cautious sip, grimacing at the bitter taste. "Your bedside manner needs work," he observed dryly. A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "You're lucky I didn't add the skunk cabbage. Father recommended it, but I took pity on you." This small exchange, the closest they had come to normalcy since her arrival, seemed to shift something between them. Not forgiveness, Sarah wasn't ready for that, but perhaps a truce of sorts, an acknowledgement of their strange, complicated connection. "You wanted to tell me about Harrison," Sarah prompted as they ate, "about his connection to my family." Mason nodded, his expression growing serious once more. "Harrison is your mother's brother." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. "My uncle, that's impossible. My mother never mentioned a brother." "Because she had disowned him years before you were born," Mason explained. "Harrison was always ambitious, always searching for power and influence. When he married into a wealthy Confederate family and began supporting their cause, your mother cut all ties with him." "But why would he order the death of his own sister? His niece, Barton?" Mason's expression darkened. "For the Reed estate. Your father came from old money, Sarah. The plantation, the investments, it was all entailed. With your parents dead and you presumed lost, Harrison was the next male relative in line to inherit." Sarah's mind reeled with the implications. So all this, my parents' deaths, my 8 years of slavery, was about money? About inheritance? "Partly," Mason agreed, "but it was also about your father's list." Augustus had evidence that Harrison was stealing from both Confederate and Union supply chains, selling essential goods to the highest bidder while soldiers starved. And Holloway? Where does he fit in? Holloway was Harrison's enforcer, still is. He carried out the executions, made sure no evidence remained, or so he thought. Sarah processed this information slowly, trying to reconcile these new revelations with her fractured memories of that terrible night. If Harrison inherited everything, why is Holloway still hunting me? Why does he care about a list after all these years? "Because the list didn't just detail their crimes," Mason explained. "It also included the location of something far more valuable, a cache of gold and currency they stole during the war. Millions in today's money, hidden somewhere only Augustus knew." "And they think I know where it is," Sarah concluded, understanding dawning. "Exactly. They believe Augustus would have told his daughter, would have left some clue with you before the end." Sarah shook her head. "He didn't, at least not that I remember." Mason studied her thoughtfully. "Maybe not directly, but that scar on your wrist, has it ever struck you as unusual that it's shaped exactly like an hourglass?" Sarah glanced down at the crescent scar that had been part of her identity for as long as she could remember. "I got this trying to rescue a fox kit from a thorn bush. I was 8 years old." Yes, that's the story, but Augustus was clever. He knew memory can be forced, information extracted, but a scar, a seemingly accidental mark on a child's skin that could hide in plain sight. "You think my scar is a clue to the location of this stolen gold?" Sarah couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "I think it's possible," Mason replied. "Augustus mentioned it specifically when he was dying. The scar like an hourglass. He wanted me to find you because of it." Before Sarah could respond, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Mason rose quickly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Stay here," he warned, moving cautiously to the window. Sarah tensed, fearing Holloway had returned, but Mason's posture relaxed slightly as he recognized the visitor. "It's Josephine Turner," he explained, holstering his weapon. "Lives on a small farm about 5 miles east. Her husband died last winter." He opened the door to reveal a tired-looking woman in her 30s, a small boy of perhaps 4 clinging to her skirts. The woman's face was drawn with worry, her clothes simple but clean. "Mr. Everett," she began without preamble, "it's Jacob. The fever's back, worse than before. I wouldn't trouble you, but he can't keep anything down, and he's burning up something fierce." Mason's expression shifted instantly from caution to concern. "How long has he been like this?" "Since yesterday afternoon. I tried the willow bark tea you showed me, but it's not helping this time." Mason glanced back at Sarah, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, understanding without words. "Mrs. Turner, this is my niece, Sarah," Mason introduced, the lie coming smoothly. "She has considerable medical knowledge. If you'll allow it, we'd both take a look at Jacob." Relief washed over the woman's face. "Thank the Lord. Yes, anything that might help." Sarah moved to the apothecary room, quickly gathering supplies while Mason saddled their horses. Within minutes, they were riding toward the Turner farm, Mrs. Turner and her young son sharing a horse ahead of them. "Typhoid?" Sarah asked quietly as they rode. Mason nodded. "I fear so. There's been an outbreak in the settlement of freed slaves near here. Jacob's older brother works there sometimes." "How many cases?" "6 that I know of. 2 deaths so far." Sarah absorbed this information with a physician's detachment. "Have you treated typhoid before?" "In the war, yes, but supplies were better then." Mason glanced at her. "Your father had an effective treatment detailed in his journals. Did you happen to read that section?" "Volume 3, pages 28 through 32, Sarah confirmed. "I'll need chloroform and several herbs we may not have." Mason's expression was a mixture of surprise and approval. "I have a small supply of chloroform. As for the herbs, Mrs. Turner knows the area well. She can help us find what we need." They arrived at the Turner farm, a modest homestead with a small vegetable garden and a few chickens scratching in the yard. Inside the simple cabin, a boy of about 12 lay on a narrow bed, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored. Sarah approached, falling naturally into the role of healer. She placed a hand on the boy's forehead, noting the extreme heat radiating from his skin. "How long has he been delirious?" she asked, checking his pulse. "Since dawn," Mrs. Turner replied, hovering anxiously nearby. "He was talking nonsense, calling for his pa." Sarah examined the boy thoroughly, noting the characteristic rose spots on his abdomen that confirmed Mason's diagnosis. As she worked, she found herself drawing on both her father's teachings and the practical experience she'd gained during her years of captivity, where she'd often been called upon to tend to sick slaves when no doctor was available. "We need to bring the fever down immediately," Sarah decided, turning to Mrs. Turner. "Do you have a wash basin and cool water?" As the woman hurried to comply, Sarah outlined her treatment plan to Mason in low tones. He listened attentively, neither questioning her authority nor attempting to assert his own. For the next hour, they worked together seamlessly, Sarah directing the treatment while Mason supported her efforts. She mixed tinctures from the supplies they'd brought, explaining each step to Mrs. Turner so she could continue the treatments after they left. By the time they had done all they could, Jacob's fever had dropped slightly, and he was resting more comfortably. Sarah gave Mrs. Turner detailed instructions for the next 2 days, promising to return if the boy's condition worsened. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Turner pressed a small jar of honey into Sarah's hands. "It's not much," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude, "but it's all I have to offer." Sarah tried to refuse the gift, but Mason caught her eye and shook his head slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Turner," she said instead, understanding that allowing the woman this small gesture of payment preserved her dignity. Outside, as they mounted their horses, Sarah noticed Mason watching her with an unreadable expression. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You were magnificent in there," he said simply, like watching Augustus in his prime. The comparison to her father, not as a possession to be reclaimed, but as a healer to be emulated, touched Sarah deeply. For the first time since her rescue, she felt a flicker of her old self, the person she might have become if the war hadn't stolen her future. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in thought. It was Mason who finally broke the quiet. There will be more cases. The settlement has poor sanitation, and the people there are already weakened from a hard winter. Sarah nodded, already anticipating his next words. They won't come to us, Mason continued, too afraid of Holloway and his men, who've made it clear freedmen aren't welcome in town. We would need to go to them. The implication was clear. Mason was inviting her to join him in treating the outbreak, not as an assistant or a student, but as an equal partner. It was a gesture of trust and respect offered without demand or expectation. When do we leave? Sarah asked, her decision made. A smile touched Mason's lips, transforming his weathered face. Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. We'll need tonight to prepare supplies. That evening, they worked side by side in the apothecary, preparing medications and organizing supplies for treating multiple patients. The shared purpose created a temporary bridge across the gulf of their complicated past. As they worked, Sarah found herself asking questions about her father, about the man he had been before the war, before she was old enough to truly know him. He was brilliant, Mason recalled, a note of admiration in his voice. Could diagnose ailments other doctors missed entirely, but it was his compassion that set him apart. He treated everyone, rich planters, poor farmers, slaves, with the same care and respect. Even though he owned slaves himself, Sarah couldn't keep the edge from her voice. Mason's expression turned thoughtful. Augustus inherited slaves with the plantation, yes, but by the time the war began, he'd freed most of them, keeping only those who chose to stay as paid servants. It caused quite a scandal locally. This aligned with Sarah's fragmented memories of friendly faces in the kitchen, of lessons shared with the housekeeper's children, of her father treating injured workers regardless of their status. It was actually his stance on slavery that first connected us, Mason continued, measuring herbs with practiced precision. I was new to Texas, setting up my practice in town. Your father came to welcome me, and we discovered a shared belief that the institution was not just morally wrong, but medically unsound. How so? Augustus had documented how slave conditions led to increased disease, infant mortality, reduced life expectancy. He was using medicine to argue against slavery when moral arguments fell on deaf ears. Sarah absorbed this new facet of her father, this legacy of compassion and justice she had almost forgotten. And my mother? What was she like? A genuine smile crossed Mason's face. Elizabeth was a force of nature, brilliant, outspoken, fiercely loyal. She and Clara were inseparable, despite the social pressures against their friendship. Because Clara was Northern? That and because your mother openly defied convention. She taught slaves to read, hosted abolitionists at your home, never feared speaking her mind even when it cost her socially. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, trying to conjure her mother's face, her voice. The memories were faded, like looking at a daguerreotype left too long in the sun. She played the piano, Sarah said softly. I remember sitting beside her on the bench. She did, Mason confirmed, often joined by Clara. They would play duets while your father and I talked medicine or politics. His voice grew wistful. Those evenings at your family's home were islands of civilization in an increasingly barbaric time. The image was so vivid, so achingly normal, that Sarah had to turn away to hide the sudden tears. 8 years of bondage had taught her to conceal vulnerability, to lock away grief where it couldn't be used against her. Mason noticed but respectfully said nothing, returning his attention to the medications they were preparing. After a moment, Sarah composed herself and rejoined him at the workbench. As the night deepened, their conversation turned to more immediate concerns: the typhoid outbreak, the precautions they would need to take, the limitations of their supplies. The settlement has about 40 people, Mason explained, mostly women and children. Many of the men still haven't returned from the war, or never will. Former slaves? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Yes, they established the community about 2 years ago on abandoned land. They're hardworking people, but Harrison has been trying to force them out, claiming the land belongs to his brother-in-law's estate. My father's estate, Sarah realized. Land that should have been mine. Exactly. Mason's expression hardened. Harrison has been systematically stealing your inheritance piece by piece. The freed slaves are just his latest targets. Sarah's jaw tightened. Then we have even more reason to help them. They worked until midnight, preparing for the next day's journey. When they finally retired to their rooms, Sarah found herself too restless for sleep. She returned to the sitting room and the piano that had drawn her the previous night. This time, she played with more confidence, letting the music wash over her, connecting her to the mother she had lost, the life that had been stolen. She didn't hear Mason approach until he spoke from the doorway. That was Elizabeth's favorite piece, Whitey said softly. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Sarah's hand stilled on the keys. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. Pain does that well enough on its own. Mason moved into the room, settling into the armchair near the piano. In the dim lamplight, the lines of suffering on his face were more pronounced. I could prepare something stronger for the pain, Sarah offered. There's laudanum in the apothecary. Mason shook his head. I need my wits about me, especially with what's coming. You mean treating the typhoid cases? That and whatever Holloway is planning. Mason's gaze was distant. He won't let you go easily, Sarah. Not now that he knows you're here. Because of this mythical list in gold that he thinks I know about? There's nothing mythical about it, Mason said, his voice taking on an edge of urgency. Your father's list exists. I've seen parts of it, enough to understand why Harrison and Holloway are willing to kill to keep it hidden. And the gold, is that real too? Yes, Union payroll, Confederate treasury, private fortunes, all stolen during the chaos of war. Harrison and Holloway were just two members of a larger conspiracy, men who used the conflict to enrich themselves while others died by the thousands. Sarah studied Mason's face in the soft lamplight, searching for deception, but finding only grim certainty. If this is true, why haven't you gone to the authorities? Which authorities? Mason countered. Harrison is the highest law in the county. His friends control the state courts. The federal marshals are stretched thin across Texas, and many are former Confederates themselves with little interest in reopening war wounds. The hopelessness of their positions settled over Sarah like a physical weight. So what's the point? Why keep fighting if the system is so corrupt? Because not everyone is corrupt, Mason replied. There are still good men in positions of power, men like Colonel Robert Thornton of the federal marshals in Austin. With the right evidence, he could bring Harrison and his entire network to justice. And you think I hold that evidence? In my memories or this scar? Sarah held up her wrist, the hourglass shape visible in the lamplight. I think Augustus believed you did. Mason leaned forward, his expression intent. Sarah, before he died, your father told me something I've never fully understood. He said, the map is in the hourglass, where time stands still. At the time, I thought it was just delirium from his wounds, but now, seeing your scar again after all these years, I wonder if he was speaking literally. Sarah traced the outline of her scar absently. Even if that were true, even if this scar somehow contained information about the gold or the list, what good would it do us now? I'm just a one woman. You're a dying man, against a corrupt judge, a murderous sheriff, and their entire network. What chance do we have? Mason's response was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch, multiple riders moving at speed. Get your gun, Mason ordered, rising quickly despite his illness, and meet me in the barn, quickly. As Sarah hurried to her room to retrieve the revolver Mason had given her for protection, she heard him moving through the house, gathering essential supplies. The peaceful interlude of music and memories was shattered, reality intruding with the thunder of approaching horses and the certain knowledge that Holloway had returned. This time not to talk, but to take what he believed was his. Sarah grabbed her father's medical bag, now filled with essential supplies, and the revolver Mason had given her for protection. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her hands remained steady, a testament to the strength forged through 8 years of hardship. Outside, she could hear the riders drawing closer, at least 4 or 5 horses approaching at speed. Through the window, she caught glimpses of torchlight dancing against the darkness. She met Mason in the hallway. His face was grim, but composed, the revolver in his hand held with practiced familiarity. Back door, he instructed. We'll go through the orchard to the barn. The horses are ready. What about your medical supplies, your journals? Sarah asked, thinking of her father's precious writings. Already packed what we can carry. Mason gestured to a small saddlebag by the door. Your father's most important journals are there. The rest, he shook his head. We can't risk being caught. They slipped out the rear door just as the first riders reached the front of the cabin. Staying low, they moved swiftly through the small apple orchard that separated the house from the barn. The night was moonless, the darkness their ally as they evaded the approaching men. From the shadows, Sarah could make out Holloway's silhouette as he dismounted, flanked by the Yates brothers and two other men she didn't recognize. All were armed, their intentions clear in the methodical way they spread out to surround the cabin. "Everett!" Holloway's voice carried through the night air. "I know you're in there. Come out now and bring the Reed girl." Mason touched Sarah's arm, guiding her toward the barn side entrance. Inside, two horses stood saddled and ready, loaded with provisions and medical supplies. Mason had been preparing for this possibility, Sarah realized. The necessity of a quick escape. "When we ride out, stay close," Mason whispered as they mounted. "Follow the creek bed north for 2 miles, then east toward the ridge. Don't stop for anything." Sarah nodded, checking that her father's medical bag was securely attached to the saddle. As Mason led the way to the barn doors, they heard Holloway's men forcing their way into the cabin, furniture crashing as they searched. "Now," Mason said, throwing open the doors. They burst from the barn at full gallop, startling Holloway's men who had been focused on the cabin. Shouts erupted behind them, followed quickly by gunshots. Sarah kept low in the saddle as Mason had taught her, following his lead as they thundered across the open ground toward the tree line. A bullet whistled past her ear, too close for comfort. She resisted the urge to look back, focusing instead on the dark silhouette of Mason ahead of her and the approaching safety of the trees. They reached the creek bed and turned north, the horses' hooves splashing through shallow water. Behind them, Holloway's voice carried on the night air, ordering his men to pursue. More shots rang out, but they were riding blind now, firing at shadows. For nearly an hour, they pushed the horses hard, following the winding creek before turning east as Mason had instructed. Only when they reached a rocky outcropping that offered cover did Mason signal a halt, allowing the winded horses to rest. "Did anyone follow?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she scanned the darkness behind them. Mason shook his head. "Creek water hides tracks, and we had a good head start." He winced, pressing a hand to his chest. "You're hurt," Sarah observed, immediately alert to signs of injury. "Not shot," Mason reassured her, though his breathing was labored. "Just the consumption. Hard riding doesn't help." Sarah reached for her medical bag, but Mason waved her off. "No time. We need to keep moving. There's a place about 5 miles ahead where we can rest properly." They rode more slowly now, conserving the horses' strength while putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Holloway's men. The night was clear but dark, the stars providing just enough light to navigate the rugged terrain. As they rode, Sarah's mind churned with questions. How did they know to come tonight? Were they watching the ranch? Possibly, Mason conceded, or someone talked. Holloway has informants throughout the county, people who owe him favors or fear his retribution. Where are we going? To find a man named Ezekiel Washington. He was part of your father's network during the war, helped Union prisoners escape to Mexico. Mason glanced at her. If anyone knows the full extent of your father's list or the missing gold, it would be Ezekiel. And you trust him? Mason's expression was grave in the starlight. With my life, which admittedly isn't worth much these days. A coughing fit overtook him, forcing them to stop briefly. Sarah watched with growing concern as Mason struggled to catch his breath, the handkerchief he pressed to his mouth coming away dark with blood. You need rest, she insisted. Real rest, not just a few minutes on horseback. Mason nodded weakly, unable to argue. 1/2 mile ahead, Old Trapper's cabin. We can stop there. They reached the cabin just as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. It was a simple structure, little more than a single room with a stone fireplace, but it was secluded and defensible, built against a rocky hillside with a clear view of the approaching trail. Inside, Mason collapsed onto the single cot, his face ashen with exhaustion. Sarah immediately set to work, preparing the treatment she had developed from her father's journals. As she measured herbs and mixed tinctures, she kept glancing at Mason, noting his shallow breathing and the perspiration beading his forehead. Here, she said finally, helping him sit up enough to drink the medicine. This should ease the pain and help clear your lungs. Mason drank without protest, grimacing at the bitter taste. When he finished, Sarah helped him lie back down, checking his pulse and respiration with practiced movements. "Will you at least tell me if we're going to live through the day?" he asked, a shadow of his dry humor returning despite his weakness. "If you rest and follow my instructions, yes," Sarah replied firmly. "Though I can't promise the same for Holloway if he finds us." A faint smile touched Mason's lips. "You sound just like your mother when you say things like that. Elizabeth never suffered fools gladly either." Sarah busied herself preparing a simple meal from their provisions, uncomfortable with the comparison to a mother she barely remembered. As she worked, her thoughts returned to the hourglass scar on her wrist, the mark Mason believed might hold the key to her father's hidden evidence. "Tell me more about this list," she said as she brought Mason a cup of broth. "What exactly did my father document?" Mason accepted the broth gratefully, the medicine already easing his breathing somewhat. It was comprehensive: names, dates, transactions, men who had stolen Union payroll, Confederate treasury, private fortunes, men who had executed innocent civilians to seize their property under the guise of martial law. Men like Harrison and Holloway. Yes, but they were just part of a larger network. The list named judges, bankers, military officers, men who have since rebuilt their fortunes and reputations in the aftermath of the war. "And the gold, was that documented too?" Mason nodded. Augustus believed they had hidden millions in stolen gold and currency in an abandoned silver mine. The list contained coded directions to its location. "But if my father knew where it was, why didn't he just tell the authorities?" "Because the authorities were complicit. Local law enforcement, state courts, even some federal officials. The corruption ran deep." Mason's expression darkened. "And those who weren't corrupt were often Confederate sympathizers with little interest in prosecuting their own." Sarah absorbed this information, her mind working through the implications. So instead, he created this list as insurance, evidence to use if they ever came after him. Exactly. Augustus never intended to use it for personal gain. He wanted justice, accountability for those who had profited from the war while others sacrificed everything. "But they found out," Sarah concluded. "They discovered he had evidence against them." "Yes," Mason confirmed grimly. "Someone betrayed him, told Harrison and Holloway about the list. They came for your family that night, determined to destroy all evidence of their crimes." Sarah's gaze sharpened. "Someone betrayed him? Was it you, Mason?" The question hung in the air, direct and unflinching. Mason met her eyes steadily, refusing to look away from the accusation. "No," he said quietly. "Not about the list. My betrayal was unwitting, mentioning to Holloway that Augustus had connections to the Union. I never knew about the list until after your family was attacked." Sarah studied his face, searching for deception, but finding only the same haunted regret she'd seen since her rescue. "Then who?" "I don't know for certain," Mason admitted, "but I have suspicions. There was a man named Carter, a lawyer who worked with both your father and Harrison. He disappeared shortly after your family's murder, reportedly drowned while crossing the Brazos River. His body was never found." "Convenient," Sarah observed dryly. "Indeed, too convenient to be coincidence." They lapsed into silence, Sarah lost in thought, and as Mason rested, the medicine gradually taking effect. Outside, the day brightened, sunlight filtering through the cabin's single window. They would remain here until nightfall, Mason had decided, traveling under cover of darkness to reduce the risk of discovery. Sarah used the time to study her father's journals more thoroughly, focusing on his wartime entries that might contain clues about the list or the stolen gold. As she read, a picture emerged of a man torn between his Southern heritage and his moral conviction that the Confederacy was fighting for an unjust cause. Augustus Reed had used his position as a respected local physician to gather intelligence for the Union, while publicly maintaining a facade of Confederate loyalty. It was a dangerous game, one that had ultimately cost him everything. As noon approached, Sarah prepared another dose of medicine for Mason, noting with satisfaction that his breathing had improved and some color had returned to his face. "You have a gift," he observed as she checked his pulse. "Your father would be proud." "I learned out of necessity," Sarah replied, her voice neutral. "When your property, any skill that makes you valuable improves your chances of survival." Mason flinched at the bluntness of her statement, but didn't look away. I'm sorry, Sarah, for all of it. For my part in what happened to your family, for not finding you sooner. 8 years is a long time to search for someone, Sarah acknowledged, her tone softening slightly. Most would have given up. I gave your father my word. Mason's voice was quiet but firm, and I owed him a debt I could never repay. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What debt? He saved my life at Gettysburg. I was working in a field hospital when Confederate forces overran our position. Augustus was there as a prisoner, helping treat wounded from both sides. When a Confederate soldier recognized me as the Union surgeon who had amputated his brother's leg, he aimed his rifle at my back. Mason's gaze grew distant with memory. Augustus threw himself between us, took the bullet meant for me, told the soldier I was too valuable as a doctor to waste. That sounds like my father, Sarah said softly, another fragment of memory sliding into place. He always believed healing transcended sides. It wasn't the only time he saved me. Mason hesitated, then continued with evident difficulty. After I unwittingly gave Holloway information about your family, Augustus warned me not to return to my ranch, said Holloway couldn't be trusted. I didn't listen. What happened? Holloway sent men to my home while I was away, ostensibly searching for Union spies. They found some of Augustus's letters to me, proof of our friendship. Mason's voice faltered. They killed Clara, burned our home to the ground. By the time I returned, it was too late. The revelation landed like a stone in the quiet cabin. Sarah had known about Clara's death from the journal, but not the circumstances, not the direct connection to her own family's tragedy. So we both lost everything to these men, she said finally. Yes, and that's why I've spent 8 years searching for you, for the list, for any way to bring them to justice. Mason met her gaze directly. I'm dying, Sarah. I won't see Harrison and Holloway face justice. But you can. You're the key to everything. Your father's legacy, his evidence, his quest for accountability. Before Sarah could respond, a sound outside the cabin froze them both. Hoofbeats, approaching slowly but deliberately. Mason reached for his revolver, motioning for Sarah to move away from the window. One rider, he whispered, peering cautiously through a crack in the shutters. Moving carefully. Sarah retrieved her own weapon, positioning herself where she could cover the door while remaining out of sight. Mason's illness made him vulnerable. If it came to a fight, she would need to be ready. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the cabin. A moment of tense silence followed, then 3 short knocks on the door, followed by a single longer one. Mason's posture relaxed slightly. It's Ezekiel, he said, moving to open the door. The man who entered was tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of rich mahogany and a close-cropped beard threaded with silver. Despite being in his 50s, he moved with the fluid grace of a much younger man, his eyes missing nothing as they swept the cabin interior. Mason, he acknowledged with a nod, cutting it close this time. Holloway raided the ranch last night, Mason explained, holstering his weapon. We barely got out. Ezekiel's gaze shifted to Sarah, assessing her with calm intensity. So you found her, he said simply, after all these years. Sarah Reed, Mason confirmed, Augustus's daughter. I see the resemblance, Ezekiel observed. Same eyes, same determined chin. He inclined his head respectfully. Your father was a good man, Miss Reed, one of the few whites who treated us as equals. Sarah studied the newcomer with cautious interest. You knew my father well? Well enough to trust him with my life and the lives of dozens of escaped slaves he helped guide to freedom. Ezekiel removed his hat, revealing a jagged scar that ran from his temple to his ear. He patched me up more times than I can count, never asking for payment, never questioning why I was injured. Ezekiel was part of your father's intelligence network, Mason explained. Carried messages between Union sympathizers throughout Texas and Louisiana. And now, Sarah asked? Now I lead a settlement of freed people about 15 miles east of here. Former slaves building new lives. A shadow crossed Ezekiel's face. Though Harrison and Holloway have been trying to drive us off the land since we established it. Using what authority? Sarah's voice sharpened, claiming it's part of the Reed estate, your family's property, and that as executor, Harrison has the right to quell it. Ezekiel's expression was grim. 3 families have already been forced out. One man was lynched for trespassing when he refused to leave. Sarah's jaw tightened. So Harrison is not only stealing my inheritance, but using my family's name to persecute innocent people. That's part of why I've been looking for you all these years, Mason said. With you alive, Harrison's claim as executor can be challenged. Assuming we can prove who I am, Sarah pointed out, after 8 years with no documentation, who would take my word over that of a respected judge? That's where the list comes in, Ezekiel interjected. Augustus didn't just document their crimes. He included proof of his own identity and yours, birth records, property deeds, bank statements, all hidden with the list and the gold. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. He thought of everything. Your father was a careful man, Ezekiel agreed. He knew what he was risking by gathering this evidence. He made preparations for every contingency, including his own death. Which brings us back to the hourglass, Mason said, glancing at Sarah's wrist, and what it might mean. Ezekiel's gaze followed Mason's, focusing on the scar. May I? He asked, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah placed her wrist in his weathered palm. Ezekiel examined the scar closely, turning her arm to view it from different angles. Hourglass, he murmured, time standing still. His expression shifted, understanding dawning. Of course, the timeless mine. What about it? Mason asked. It was called Timeless Silver Mine because the main shaft was so deep, miners said time stood still down there. It was abandoned before the war when a collegiate collapse killed several workers. And you think that's where the gold is hidden? Sarah asked skeptically. It fits, Ezekiel insisted. Augustus mentioned the mine several times in coded messages, said it was where justice waits when time stands still. Mason's expression grew thoughtful. Where is this mine located? About 40 miles southeast of here, in the hills near the old Spanish mission. Ezekiel released Sarah's wrist. But we can't go there directly. Holloway has men watching all the main roads, and the mine itself may be guarded. Then what do you suggest? Sarah asked. We need help and a diversion. Ezekiel turned to Mason. The meeting at Cypress Creek is in 3 days. Many of Augustus's old network will be there, including some who have infiltrated Harrison's circle. With their help, we might be able to create enough confusion to reach the mine safely. Cypress Creek is risky, Mason cautioned. If Holloway has informants, it's a risk we have to take, Ezekiel countered. We can't do this alone, not with your illness worsening and Holloway's men hunting us. The logic was sound, though Sarah could see Mason's reluctance. To place their fate in the hands of others, some of whom might be compromised, was a dangerous gamble. Cypress Creek, she said finally, but we approach cautiously, with a plan for retreat if things go wrong. Mason studied her face, noting the decisive set of her jaw, so like Augustus's when his mind was made up. He nodded once, accepting her judgment. We'll leave at nightfall, Ezekiel said, rising. I'll guide you along routes Holloway's men don't know. We should reach the meeting point by tomorrow evening. As Ezekiel stepped outside to check his horse, Mason turned to Sarah. You don't have to do this, he reminded her softly. This fight was mine and your father's. You've suffered enough already. Sarah met his gaze steadily. It became my fight the moment they murdered my parents and sold me into slavery. I want my life back, Mason. My name, my inheritance, my dignity. And I want Harrison and Holloway to pay for what they've done, to my family, to yours, to Ezekiel's people. A look of pride and something like hope crossed Mason's weathered face. Then we'll see it through together, however it ends. And they traveled through the night, Ezekiel leading them along hidden trails and dry creek beds to avoid detection. Mason's condition worsened as they rode, the exertion taxing his diseased lungs despite Sarah's medicines. By dawn, when they stopped to rest in a secluded grove, he could barely remain in the saddle. You need to rest properly, Sarah insisted as she helped him down from his horse. At least for a few hours. Mason didn't argue, a sign of how weak he had become. Ezekiel helped Sarah make a small, sheltered camp where Mason could lie down, hidden from any passing riders. His time is short, Ezekiel observed quietly as they stepped away to let Mason rest. Days, not weeks. Sarah nodded grimly. I know. I'm doing what I can with the medicines we have, but she left the sentence unfinished. He's held on this long through sheer determination, Ezekiel said. The need to find you, to make amends for his part in what happened to your family. Did you know, Sarah asked suddenly, about his role in my parents' deaths? Ezekiel's expression was solemn. I knew he had unwittingly given Holloway information about your father's union connections. Mason told me himself when he first began searching for you. He has carried that guilt for 8 years. Yet you still helped him, trusted him. Because I saw his remorse, his determination to make things right. Ezekiel's voice softened. And because your father forgave him before he died. Augustus's last words to Mason were about finding you, protecting you, not condemnation for his mistake. This new perspective gave Sarah pause. She had been judging Mason by the single worst moment of his life, the mistake that had set tragic events in motion. Yet over the past days, she had seen his character in 100 small actions. His gentle treatment of the injured mare, his respect for her medical knowledge, his willingness to risk his life for the Turner boy, his offer of genuine choice when she questioned her involvement in their quest for justice. We should let him sleep as long as possible, she decided, returning her attention to the present. We can reach Cypress Creek by nightfall, tomorrow, even with a late start. Ezekiel agreed, and they settled into the quiet routine of a camp at rest, keeping watch, tending the horses, preparing simple food. As noon approached, Sarah checked on Mason, finding him awake but weakened, his breathing labored. The medicine isn't working as well, he acknowledged as she examined him. The disease is progressing faster than we anticipated. Then I'll try something stronger, Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the concern tightening her chest. She prepared a more potent mixture from her dwindling supplies, adding a small amount of laudanum to ease his pain. They reached Cypress Creek the following evening, guided by Ezekiel through country so rugged that Holloway's men wouldn't have been able to follow even if they had picked up the trail. The meeting place was a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by a narrow path that wound through a steep ravine. A dozen men and women had already gathered, their faces lighting with recognition when they saw Ezekiel. Sarah helped Mason dismount, noting with concern how his strength seemed to diminish by the hour. Despite the potent medicines she had administered throughout the day, his breathing remained labored, his skin clammy to the touch. "Can you stand?" she asked quietly, not wanting to draw attention to his weakness. Mason nodded, though the effort clearly cost him. "Long enough to meet the others," he whispered. "Then I'll need to rest." A tall, distinguished-looking black man approached them, his bearing that of a natural leader. Ezekiel greeted him with a firm handshake. "Benjamin, this is Mason Everett and Sarah Reed, Augustus Reed's daughter." Benjamin's eyes widened. "We thought you were dead, Miss Reed. After all these years." He turned to the others. "Everyone, Augustus Reed's daughter lives." A murmur of amazement ran through the gathering. Several people approached, each with a story of how Augustus had helped them, protected them, saved them. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by this living testament to her father's legacy, a network of people still working to fulfill his vision of justice years after his death. As the initial excitement subsided, Benjamin led them to a small cabin at the edge of the clearing. Inside, a table was covered with maps and documents, illuminated by lantern light. "We've been planning this for months," he explained, pointing to a detailed map of the county. "Harrison has been systematically stripping away land from freed people, using forged deeds and corrupt courts to legalize his theft." "And my father's estate?" Sarah asked. "The land he deeded to Ezekiel's community?" Benjamin's expression darkened. "Harrison filed papers claiming the deed was a forgery, that Augustus Reed couldn't have signed it because he was already dead when it was dated." "That's a lie," Ezekiel said flatly. "I was there when Augustus signed it, 3 days before Holloway's men came for him." "We know," Benjamin assured him, "but Harrison controls the courts, without evidence to disprove his claims." "The list," Sarah said, understanding dawning. "That's why he's so desperate to find it. Not just to hide his wartime crimes, but to cover up his current corruption." Mason sank into a chair, his strength finally giving out. "The gold is just a bonus for him," he said weakly. "What Harrison really wants is to destroy any record that might challenge his authority over the Reed estate." Sarah helped Mason take another dose of medicine, her mind racing. "We need to reach the mine tomorrow," she decided, before Harrison realizes we're close. Benjamin exchanged glances with Ezekiel. "Not we," he said gently. "Mason can't make that journey. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Mason raised a hand to stop her. He's right, Sarah, he admitted. I'll only slow you down, put everyone at risk. I'm not leaving you, Sarah insisted, echoing her words from before. Yes, you are, Mason countered, his voice finding strength and certainty. Your father's list is more important than my life. It always has been. The truth of those words hung in the air, undeniable despite Sarah's reluctance to accept them. After a moment, Benjamin spoke again. Mason can stay here with our doctor. The rest of us will create diversions to draw Holloway's men away from the mine. Ezekiel and 2 others will accompany you to Timeless. Sarah looked at Mason, seeing in his face that the decision was already made. He had come this far, found her, set her on the path to reclaiming her father's legacy. Now he was entrusting her to finish what he couldn't. I'll come back, she promised softly. A sad smile touched Mason's lips. Don't make promises you can't keep, Doctor. The camp doctor, an elderly woman with knowing eyes, took charge of Mason, settling him in a small side room of the cabin. As Sarah prepared to leave with the others, Mason called her back. In my pocket, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Your father's watch. Sarah reached into his coat and withdrew the silver timepiece she had seen earlier. Opening it again, she studied the scratched map on the back, committing its details to memory. The watch itself is the key, Mason explained. It fits into a mechanism in the hidden chamber. Won't open without it. I'll find it, Sarah assured him. I know you will. Mason's eyes were growing heavy, the laudanum taking effect. You're Augustus's daughter. Never doubted. You'd finish what he started. Sarah squeezed his hand gently, then left him to rest. Outside, Ezekiel and the others were making final preparations for the journey to Timeless Mine. The plan was simple but dangerous. Benjamin and most of the group would stage incidents to draw Holloway's attention away from the mine, while Sarah, Ezekiel, and 2 trusted men would slip through to find the hidden chamber and the evidence it contained. As dawn broke, they set out, 4 riders moving silently through the misty forest. Sarah felt the weight of her father's watch in her pocket, a tangible connection to the man she barely remembered, but whose legacy she carried. The journey to Timeless Mine took most of the day, winding through terrain so rugged that no one without expert knowledge of the land could have navigated it. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. On the far side, cut into the rocky hillside, was the abandoned entrance to the mine, a dark opening like a wound in the earth. No signs of guards, Ezekiel observed, scanning the area through a small spyglass. Benjamin's diversions must be working. Or it's a trap, one of the other men suggested, his voice low with caution. Either way, we proceed as planned, Sarah decided. We've come too far to turn back now. They descended into the valley as dusk approached, the gathering darkness providing additional cover. The mine entrance was partially collapsed, requiring them to dig away debris before they could squeeze through. Inside, the air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Ezekiel lit a lantern, its glow pushing back the darkness to reveal a tunnel that stretched away into the mountain. Timber supports, weathered but still solid, lined the walls, and the remains of old mining equipment lay scattered about. According to the map, Sarah said, studying her father's watch, we need to follow the main shaft for about 100 yards, then look for a side tunnel marked with an X. They moved forward cautiously, alert for signs of collapse or hidden dangers. The main shaft sloped gently downward, leading them deeper into the earth. After what seemed like an eternity of careful progress, they reached a junction where 3 smaller tunnels branched off from the main shaft. There, Ezekiel pointed to a faint marking scratched into the timber support beside the rightmost tunnel. It was barely visible, weathered by time, but unmistakably an X. Sarah felt a surge of excitement. This is it, the side tunnel. The passage was narrower than the main shaft, forcing them to proceed in single file, hunched over to avoid the low ceiling. After about 50 yards, it opened into a small chamber where the miners had evidently followed a vein of silver. Here, the map on the watch became crucial, directing them to count 20 paces along the right wall, then look for a loose rock at waist height. Here, Sarah said, running her fingers over the rough stone wall, this section feels different. Ezekiel brought the lantern closer, and sure enough, one of the rocks moved slightly under pressure. With careful manipulation, it came free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a lever, crude but functional. Should I pull it? Sarah asked, suddenly hesitant now that they were so close to their goal. Ezekiel nodded. Your father put it here. It's meant for you to find. Taking a deep breath, Sarah grasped the lever and pulled. A grinding sound came from deeper in the chamber, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden passage. Augustus Reed, Ezekiel murmured, admiration in his voice. Always 3 steps ahead. The hidden passage led to a small chamber, no larger than a storage closet, cut into the living rock. At its center stood a metal box, about the size of a small trunk, with a curious depression in its lid shaped exactly like the face of a pocket watch. The key, Sarah whispered, withdrawing her father's timepiece. With trembling hands, she placed it in the depression. It fit perfectly, like a piece returning to its hole. There was a click, and the lid of the box unlocked. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, lay 2 items, a leather-bound ledger and a sealed letter addressed simply to my daughter. Beneath these, filling the remainder of the box, were stacks of gold coins and bundles of currency from both Union and Confederate treasuries. The list, Ezekiel breathed, staring at the ledger, and the stolen gold. Sarah handed the ledger to Ezekiel but kept the letter, breaking its seal with careful fingers. Inside, in her father's bold handwriting, was a message she had waited 8 years to receive. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then I am gone, but you have survived, as I always knew you would. You were always the strongest of us all, even as a child. The ledger contains everything: names, dates, transactions, evidence of crimes that will bring down powerful men. Use it wisely. The gold is blood money, stolen from both sides during our nation's darkest hour. It is rightfully yours now, but I hope you will use it as I would have, to build something better from the ashes of war. Remember that justice without mercy is just another form of vengeance. Some men deserve punishment, others redemption. The wisdom to know the difference is the greatest gift I can leave you. I love you, my daughter. I have always loved you, and I am proud of the woman you have become. Your father, Augustus Reed. Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she finished reading. 8 years of hardship, of being stripped of her identity and reduced to property, and now here was her father's voice reaching across time to remind her of who she truly was. We should go, Ezekiel urged gently. It's not safe to linger. Sarah nodded, carefully folding the letter and returning it to its envelope. They transferred the gold and the ledger to saddlebags, making sure to leave no trace of their presence. Just as they were preparing to depart, voices echoed from the main shaft. Men approaching, their tones urgent and angry. Holloway, Ezekiel whispered, recognizing the sheriff's distinctive voice even at a distance. They must have captured one of Benjamin's men, forced him to talk. Is there another way out? Sarah asked, glancing around the chamber. No, Ezekiel replied grimly. We'll have to fight our way through. The 4 of them positioned themselves in the narrow side tunnel, weapons ready. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but her hands remained steady on her revolver. After all she had endured, after coming so close to reclaiming her father's legacy, she would not fail now. The voices grew louder, and lantern light flickered in the main shaft. Then came a sound none of them expected. Gunshots, but not directed at them. Shouts of pain and confusion followed, and the tunnel erupted into chaos. What's happening? Sarah whispered. Before Ezekiel could answer, a familiar voice called out from the darkness. Sarah? Ezekiel? Are you there? Mason, Sarah replied, disbelieving. A figure appeared at the junction of tunnels, hunched but moving with purpose. It was indeed Mason Everett, pale as death but somehow standing, a smoking revolver in his hand. The federal marshals are here, he gasped, leaning against the wall for support. Colonel Thornton came. Benjamin sent a rider. Holloway's been shot. Sarah rushed to his side, medical instincts taking over as she assessed his condition. He was burning with fever, his pulse weak and rapid, yet somehow he had dragged himself from Cypress Creek to warn them. You shouldn't be here, she scolded, supporting him as his legs threatened to give way. How did you even make the journey? A ghost of a smile touched Mason's bloodless lips. Promised your father I'd keep you safe. Before Sarah could respond, more figures appeared in the tunnel, uniformed men wearing the badges of federal marshals. At their head was a tall, stern-faced officer with graying hair and the bearing of a career soldier. Colonel Thornton, Ezekiel acknowledged with evident relief. Your timing is impeccable. Came as soon as I got Benjamin's message, Thornton replied. Holloway resisted arrest. He won't be troubling anyone again. And Harrison? Sarah asked. Thornton's expression darkened. Fled when he heard we were coming. But we'll find him. Texas isn't big enough to hide in, not when the federal government wants you. We have the evidence, Sarah said, holding up the ledger. Everything my father documented. All Harrison's crimes, all his conspirators. Then it's over, Mason whispered, his strength finally giving out as he collapsed against Sarah. Augustus can rest now, and so can I. Sarah caught him, easing him to the ground as his eyes fluttered closed. His breathing was shallow, each breath a desperate struggle. She knew without examining him further that the journey to the mine had used the last of his strength. Mason, she called urgently, cradling his head. Hold on, we'll get you out of here. His eyes opened slightly, focusing on her face with effort. No need, he murmured. I kept my promise. Found you, protected you. The rest is up to you now. You can't die, Sarah insisted, her physician's training warring with emotion. Not now, not when we've won. A faint smile touched Mason's lips. Not dying, he corrected weakly. Just finished what I started. There's a difference. Colonel Thornton knelt beside them. We need to get him to the surface. My men can carry him. But Mason shook his head slightly. No time, he whispered. Sarah, the watch. Keep it. Your father would want you to have it. Sarah clutched the silver timepiece, feeling its weight. The weight of her father's legacy, now passed fully to her. Tears blurred her vision as she realized Mason was right. There was no time, no miracle cure for the disease that had ravaged his lungs, accelerated by the desperate journey to reach her one last time. I forgive you, she said softly, the words coming from a place deeper than thought. For whatever part you played in what happened to my family. I forgive you, Mason. Relief washed over his gaunt features. Thank you, he breathed, the words barely audible. Your father would be so proud of the woman you've become. His eyes closed and he drew one final shuddering breath. Then, surrounded by the evidence of Augustus Reed's final victory over corruption, Mason Everett found the peace that had eluded him for 8 long years. 3 months later, Sarah stood on the porch of a newly constructed building on the outskirts of the Freed People's Settlement. The sign above the door read simply, Reed Everett Clinic, painted in fresh black letters against white wood. The autumn sun cast a golden light over the community, now secure in its legal right to the land Augustus Reed had deeded them. With Harrison captured trying to flee to Mexico, and most of his conspirators either arrested or dead, the courts had recognized the validity of the original deed. The stolen gold, returned to federal authorities, had been enough to ensure the settlement's future prosperity. Ezekiel approached, carrying a small wooden box. The last of Mason's things, he explained, handing it to Sarah. Found them when we cleared out his old cabin. Sarah opened the box to find a few personal items, Mason's medical instruments, a faded photograph of Clara, and a leather-bound journal she hadn't seen before. Opening it, she recognized Mason's handwriting, recording 8 years of searching for her, 8 years of trying to atone for a single terrible mistake. He never gave up, Ezekiel observed, even when everyone else said you must be dead or gone forever. I know, Sarah replied softly, closing the journal. In the end, he was more than the man who betrayed my family. He was the man who gave me back my life, my name. The clinic door opened, and a young woman emerged. Dr. Reed, the new supplies from Austin have arrived. Thank you, Hannah. I'll be right there. Sarah tucked the journal under her arm. Duty calls. Ezekiel smiled. Augustus would be proud. A Reed healing people again on Reed land. And an Everett, too, Sarah added, glancing at the sign. Mason earned that much, I think. As she entered the clinic, her clinic, Sarah felt the weight of her father's watch in her pocket, a constant reminder of the legacy she carried. Justice had been served, not perfectly, but enough to begin healing the wounds of war and betrayal. Harrison would stand trial for his crimes, as would those conspirators still living. The stolen gold had been returned, and Sarah had insisted that a portion be used to establish schools for the children of freed slaves throughout the county. It seemed a fitting use for money that had caused so much suffering, to build the future her father had envisioned, one where the color of one's skin didn't determine the course of one's life. In a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the settlement, two graves stood side by side, Augustus Reed and Mason Everett. In death, the two men were neighbors once more, their complicated friendship enduring beyond betrayal, beyond redemption, beyond forgiveness. Sarah had buried Mason there herself, ensuring he would rest near the man whose life he had both endangered and honored. His headstone bore a simple inscription: he kept his promise. As for Sarah, she had found her purpose in continuing both men's work, healing bodies and souls in a community still recovering from the war's long shadow. Some days, working in the clinic, she could almost imagine her father and Mason discussing cases as they once had, their voices just beyond hearing, their presence a comfort rather than a haunting. The Reed legacy lived on, not just in ledgers and land deeds, but in the lives touched by a woman who had endured 8 years of bondage only to emerge stronger, wiser, more determined to build something better from the ashes of the past. Sarah Reed, doctor, landowner, daughter of Augustus, free at last to write her own story. In her office, Sarah carefully placed Mason's journal on a shelf beside her father's medical texts. Then turning to her first patient of the day, she smiled. Now let's see what we can do to help you feel better. Outside, the Texas sun shone on a community building, a new future. The future Augustus Reed had sacrificed everything to make possible, and Mason Everett had given his last breath to protect. And at its heart, a woman who carried the scars of the past not as a burden, but as a map to a better tomorrow. The promise between states, the promise of healing, of reconciliation, of justice, lived on in her hands, her heart, her unwavering determination to honor all those who had fallen so that she might stand free.